If you're at 0.6 grams per kg and you start doing resistance exercise, you might not get much effect because you just don't have enough protein around to build. But if you get up into that 1.5 range, that's probably enough. And now if you really want to build, you have to do resistance exercise.
Don sir, your core clinical research is around mTOR signaling and muscle protein synthesis pathway. Sir, can you simplify that for us? Because I think that is really important to understand how protein is grown in our body and how we can prevent the sarcopenia also.
Yeah, one of the things that people need to understand is that when we grow, we get a body structure, but that body structure is constantly turning over. We're constantly breaking it down and repairing it. So if you look in the liver, the proteins in the liver, a large number of them are replaced every hour. If you look in your blood cells, we replace every blood cell in our body every 28 days. If you look in your muscles, we replace our muscle proteins at about every 30 days. So if you look in the body in a whole, about 4 times every year, you replace the equivalent of every protein in your body. And so people say, well, I've stopped growing, I don't need protein. The reality is you're much bigger than you were when a child. You have more protein to replace. You actually need more, and your efficiency of replacing it's going down. So protein actually gets more and more important. We think that process, which is synthesis and breakdown, is regulated on the synthesis side. We think that's how the body controls everything. And so we've studied synthesis a lot. And that in muscle is such a big part of the body, and the process requires a lot of energy to turn it on. And so it only turns it on after meals. It doesn't turn it on in the middle of the night. Your body is actually breaking down muscle to keep your liver running or your heart running. And so when you wake up, I talked about breakfast before, that first meal is how you start to recover your muscle health. And so we're trying to turn that process on. We know that after a protein meal, the process only runs for about 2 hours, maybe 2.5. So you have an anabolic window, a period of replacing and repairing the muscle that's about 2 hours, which is why we think multiple meals are important. Right now in the United States, people only have one big meal, dinner. So that means we get a 2-hour window that you're protecting your muscle and 22 hours where you're breaking it down. We think that's part of the aging process. So what we want to do is bring in 3 meals. So instead of 1 2-hour, 2.5-hour, we now have 3 2.5-hour meals. So we're trying to make the body more protected. How does the body regulate it? In muscle, which is kind of unusual, there's this molecule that's kind of like the brain in the muscle, and we call it mTOR. It's a protein complex that regulates protein synthesis, and it senses a lot of different things. It senses amino acids in the blood, particularly leucine. It senses hormones, particularly insulin. It senses energy, ATP, and it senses stress, particularly exercise. When all of those things are balanced correctly, muscle protein synthesis works well. So the worst of all worlds would be a low protein diet in a sedentary individual with high insulin. That's a typical adult, right?
Deadly bad.
So that's exactly the aging adult. So now it's negative. So what we want to do is increase the protein. We'd like to increase your resistance exercise, stretch, yoga, whatever. And that turns on this complex and protects your muscles.
Don sir, what's the strongest trigger for this mTOR activation? It is leucine, is it insulin, or is it resistance activation?
The strongest signal is actually leucine. Exercise sort of increases the machinery. Sedentary lifestyle actually inhibits the process. So exercise kind of releases the inhibition, so it makes it more efficient. Another way of thinking about it is if you're totally sedentary, to optimize it, it might take 45 grams of protein at a meal. But if you do a lot of resistance exercise, 25 grams might have the same effect. So it makes the system more efficient, but leucine is the dominant signal.
Sir, again, in your recent podcast outing, you mentioned that there is a 75 to 25 ratio when it comes to muscle protein synthesis for diet and resistance activity. And that is skewed towards resistance activity, which is 75% of your muscle protein synthesis is dependent on your exercise.
So
what do you think, sir?
So the exercise component is critical, and generally when you hear that, people are talking about muscle building. An athlete. So if you're trying to, if you have 0.6 grams of protein per kg and you go to 1.2, you'll probably get some muscle effect. You'll probably increase your muscle size. But if you're at 1.2 and you go to 1.8 or 2, you probably won't see additional effect. Okay. But if you're at 1.2 and you start doing resistance exercise, you'll gain muscle. So the issue is
adding on.
Yeah. So the issue is kind of where are you at? If you're at 0.6 grams per kg and you start doing resistance exercise, you might not get much effect because you just don't have enough protein around to build. Okay. But if you get up into that 1.5 range, that's probably enough. And now if you really want to build, you have to do resistance exercise.
So sir, we can conclude that BCAA, which are branched amino acid, leucine, isoleucine and valine, they are really important for mTOR and muscle protein synthesis. So should we prioritize these amino acids and not others? Like high leucine content protein meal, is there a compensation for a low overall protein meal diet?
So what we know is that leucine is a trigger for mTOR, and that turns on the machinery to build new protein. Okay, so there's lots of factors. They're called initiation factors and lots of things. So leucine turns on the system, but then to start building protein, you need all 20 amino acids. So it's like turning on a light switch, but if there's no electricity in the system, you don't get anything. You can turn on the switch, but it doesn't go anywhere. And so leucine is like that. Leucine's critical to turn on the switch, but as soon as you turn on the switch, you need all the amino acids. And so, can you take leucine alone? No. I mean, you can turn on mTOR, but it won't go anywhere. So as soon as you turn it on, you have to have the meal. One of the things we found is we talked about 30 grams at the meal. One of the things we found working with hospitalized individuals or people on weight loss is you can have a 15-gram meal of protein and add in 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, and you can make it look like it's 30 grams because you've turned it on and now we'll use those. Does it run as long? Is it as beneficial as Probably not, but in the short run, it looks about the same. So you can make a 15-gram meal look like it's 35. Okay, but you can't judge leucine and make a 0-gram meal look like it's anything. Okay, so that's what we've done. We've actually shown that leucine supplementation on a very low protein diet actually can be beneficial.
Don sir, I'm really curious to know that what kind of exercises actually promote and trigger the mTOR, which is the muscle protein synthesis pathway. Sir, like you, I'm also regularly playing singles tennis on a district level. So the general consensus is that we have to do the resistance training or weight bearing exercises. Sir, do you think that sports activities like singles tennis or badminton, cricket, football, soccer, this also promote the muscle protein synthesis pathway?
There's not really good data as to a minimum threshold for exercise. We know that being sedentary versus being active is a difference. And we know that resistance exercise is better than just running. But in terms of the amount, I don't know. We always recommend a minimum of 2 days a week that has actually resistance exercise. 3 days is better. So as I play tennis 3 to 4 days a week, and I always do weightlifting when I go to the gym. Part of my loosening up and as I get older, I find that I have to loosen up more to make the knees not hurt.
Yeah.
I always do weightlifting.
Yeah.
And that, that can be, you don't need elaborate equipment. You can do push-ups and sit-ups and squats, and you can do big muscle exercises at home. But you need to do those. Minimum threshold, I think most people would say, you need to do at least 12 reps of these different exercises as a minimum threshold. And most people would say that, doing 8 to 10 reps and 3 sets probably is sort of the maximum.
Okay. And what about the intensity, sir? Do you think that high intensity benefits when it comes to mTOR signaling?
So I, like you, play tennis, and so I do what's called HIIT exercise. So it's high intensity interval training. So when I go to the gym, I will start out doing aerobic. I'll do biking for 10, 15 minutes, and then I will go do yoga routine of stretching and things. Then I'll go to an elliptical for 10, 12 minutes, more air. So I'm keeping my heart rate up, and then I'll go lift weights for 20 minutes, and then I'll finish with some running or Stairmaster or something. So I'm going back and forth between aerobic things to keep my heart rate going, which is good for heart and respiration and circulation and burning calories. And then I do my resistance training in between, hopefully when my heart rate is still higher. If you just go into the gym and you pump some iron, you're frankly not burning many calories, your heart rate doesn't go up. So I like to do the combination. There's benefit to both. If you're just talking about muscle health, resistance is critical, stretch is critical, but aerobic helps too. So, I don't think you have to be a marathon runner to get the benefit, but you need to get your heart rate up above 120 beats per minute.
Sir, is there anything called overactivation or over-triggering of the mTOR pathway? Because recent studies have equated the mTOR activation with cancer and even insulin resistance. Sir, I would love to know about this one.
That's a great question. Again, mTOR, as my analogy earlier, is like a light switch. You turn it on, and turning it on and off 3 or 4 times doesn't make it brighter. You turn it on or it's on. The issue of overstimulation is stimulating it too many times. What we know is that when you stimulate mTOR, it will be active for 3 or 4 hours. And so that's why we always talk about protein in meals. The worst of all possible ways to address mTOR is taking a lot of small meals, which tends to be something vegetarians will do. They're constantly hungry, so they're going to nibble. They'll take small meals all day long, and that's the worst possibility for mTOR because it never goes dormant. What you want mTOR to do is cycle. There's a lot of longevity. There's a lot of longevity studies looking at mTOR, but they're all with animals. They're all with rodents. And if you put rodents in a sterile cage and you give them food ad libitum, they can eat whenever. They'll eat 24 hours a day. So mTOR is stimulated all 24 hours. And what we want to do is stimulate it and let it go idle. Stimulate it. So we're doing it 3 times a day for about 3 hours, and then it's idle all night long. That's totally different than the experiments with longevity. So I totally discount those. I think they're totally irrelevant. They're done with animal models that don't make any sense. And what we know is if you compare longevity with health, what we know is keeping your muscles healthy, avoiding diabetes, keeping your blood lipids in check, not falling and breaking a hip is far more important to longevity than something that was demonstrated in mice.
And sir, what about the insulin resistance? Do you think mTOR triggers and promotes insulin resistance?
Again, I think if you chronically stimulate it, like in a rat, where you're chronically giving too much carbohydrate and stimulating it continuously, the thing to remember is, I mentioned that leucine's a stimulation, protein's a stimulation, but so is insulin. And so a high carbohydrate diet is probably worse for overstimulating mTOR because we're snacking on it all the time. And the issue the issue isn't mTOR in muscle. The issue is mTOR in the pancreas or in the liver or in a different tissue. And those are all carbohydrate sensitive. So, I think chronic stimulation of mTOR is not a good thing, and we never recommend that. We want protein in meals and we want carbohydrates low. So we're trying to avoid overstimulation, not overstimulation, we're trying to avoid chronic stimulation. Again, it's a light switch. You can't overstimulate it. The issue is prolonged stimulation. And I think there's reason to believe that's not a good idea.
Sir, I really forgot to ask a really important question during our discussion, which is that the anabolic window post-exercise. Because generally it is said that once you do your workout, either it is resistance or cardio, there is a period of half an hour to 2 hours where your body is really activated towards protein absorption. So what's your say on it?
Here again, we're kind of guilty of being the group that sort of demonstrated that. What we know, and so I want to sort out two groups. One is somebody who's totally untrained sedentary starting to train, and somebody who's highly trained. What we know is that if you are untrained and you start to work out hard, the body goes through a very catabolic period. You're breaking down tissue. And what we know is that within a 2-hour period after that, if you take in protein right away, you'll recover really quickly. And if you don't, you stay catabolic till your next meal. Okay, so that got into the literature that you should have protein right after your resistance exercise, but that's only in an untrained individual. If you're highly trained, you won't see much benefit of that. The next meal is probably perfectly fine. And most of the data says that the exercise effect, we said exercise lowers the resistance, it increases the efficiency of mTOR. That effect will last for at least 24 hours and maybe 36. So if you're trained, the window is really long. If you're untrained, there's a real catabolic window there that we think is like 2 hours.
दोस्तों ये वीडियो अगर आपको वैल्यूएबल लगा तो इसे लाइक कर अपने सारे दोस्तों से इसे शेयर कीजिएगा। इस चैनल को सब्सक्राइब तो आप कर ही लेंगे। चलिए मिलते हैं।